Hi and welcome to Economy and World. Today we are not going to talk about a conventional financial asset, nor about a simple market fluctuation, nor about a new alternative investment instrument that promises spectacular returns in the short term. Today we are going to analyze something far more uncomfortable for the dominant narrative of the contemporary economic system. The real possibility that the very concept of wealth as we understand it in modern economies is extraordinarily fragile when the institutional structures that sustain it disappear. To do this, we will carry out a critical, technical, and structural analysis of what happens when the social contract of money breaks down. We will examine the financial autopsies of empires that collapsed and extract the lessons of the 5 assets that, historically, have proven to be the only survivors in the face of the fire of hyperinflation and civil disorder. To understand the magnitude of what we are discussing today, we must mentally place ourselves in November of 1923, in the heart of a Germany that was trying to digest the bitter consequences of the Great War. Imagine that you are standing in line in front of a small bakery in Berlin, and you look with disbelief at the price board. A basic loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks. After waiting barely 12 minutes on the cold sidewalk, just before being served, the baker comes out, crosses out the number with a marker, and coldly writes 250 billion marks. In the time it took you simply to wait your turn to buy lunch, you have just lost 30% of your real purchasing power. Behind you, a woman is not carrying a leather wallet. She is struggling to push a construction wheelbarrow full of banknotes just to buy 1 liter of fresh milk. This scene, which for many seems taken from a Hollywood science fiction dystopia, is in fact a documented historical event that has occurred more times than we would like to admit in academic economics. This phenomenon of absolute degradation is not exclusive to the past century nor to a particular political ideology. We have seen it repeat itself with terrifying mathematical precision in Zimbabwe during the year 2008, in Venezuela starting in 2018, and more recently and silently in Lebanon just last year. The fundamental problem we must address today is that fiat currencies have, by their very nature, a technical expiration date. They function in a very similar way to perishable products in a supermarket. The average lifespan of a currency based solely on faith and government decree is approximately 27 years, and we have already crossed that statistical threshold. If we consider that the current United States dollar system, based on the complete break with the gold standard, formally began in 1971 under the Nixon administration, it becomes evident that we are operating in a cycle that has exceeded its usual statistical life expectancy. The collapse of a currency is not a random event or the product of chance. It follows a structural pattern that we can divide into 5 critical stages, which operate with the inevitability of physical gravity. The first stage begins when a government systematically spends more resources than it is capable of producing or collecting. It accumulates a level of debt that becomes impossible to repay through real economic growth. In the second stage, faced with the impossibility of keeping its promises, the state resorts to the massive issuance of new money to cover its obligations. This process dilutes the value of the money that citizens already have saved. The third stage is the loss of confidence. The market begins to notice that each monetary unit buys fewer goods and services, triggering an upward price spiral that wages never manage to catch up with and generating a feeling of generalized impoverishment. The fourth stage is the panic phase. The population finally understands that the money in their pockets is a toxic asset, and a frantic race begins to exchange it for any tangible object, accelerating the velocity of money and, therefore, inflation. Finally, we reach the 5th stage, ground zero. The currency disappears as an accepted medium of exchange and the system collapses completely, forcing society to reorganize under much more primitive rules of survival. In this scenario, the question every investor must ask is not how many zeros are in their bank account. The real question is, which assets they own will retain usefulness when the institutional environment has disintegrated. The first asset on our list of survivors is, perhaps the oldest and best understood by humanity. It is also one of the most despised by modern analysts who only look at the short term, physical gold and silver. We must conceptualize gold not as an investment that seeks to generate a monthly cash flow, We must understand it as an anchor of absolute stability in an ocean of financial uncertainty. When the debt storm hits the ship of the fiat system, paper currencies can get wet and sink under their own weight. But the anchor remains fixed on the seabed of physical reality and geological scarcity. During the German collapse, those who kept their savings in paper marks were wiped off the economic map. Those who owned only a few gold coins, however, kept their relative position and their social prestige intact. It is essential to understand that gold works because of its intrinsic scarcity. This is something that central banks cannot replicate through sophisticated algorithms or high-speed printing presses in government basements. While a government can create 1 trillion monetary units out of nothing in a matter of seconds, it cannot type an ounce of gold into existence. That limitation protects the holder from the arbitrary dilution of their personal wealth. Many critics argue that gold is a dead asset because it pays no dividends. They ignore that its primary function is not aggressive growth, but insurance against the systemic insolvency of nations. In moments of deep crisis, gold often experiences massive revaluations. One clear example is the 166% increase it recorded in the years following the collapse of Lehman Brothers, showing that when fear rules, humanity always returns to the tangible. The second asset that survives chaos is the use of hard foreign currencies, a strategy that we could technically define as the search for shelter in jurisdictions with more orthodox monetary policy. In local collapse scenarios, financial survival often depends on the ability to migrate savings into a currency that still maintains the confidence of international trade and the backing of a productive economy. Take the example of a nurse in Beirut who, after 10 years of hard work and sacrifice, had saved the equivalent of $50,000 in local currency. When the Lebanese banking system collapsed, her savings came to be worth barely $1,000 in terms of real purchasing power. However, her colleague, who distrusted the system and kept physical banknotes of United States dollars or Swiss francs under her mattress, preserved the entirety of her capital and was able to face the crisis with dignity. This behavior is not a matter of political preference, but a survival instinct that economists call de facto or spontaneous dollarization. This phenomenon occurs regardless of the laws that the government in power tries to impose. We see it today in Argentina, where real estate transactions and long-term contracts are carried out exclusively in foreign currency to avoid the destructive volatility of the national currency. When a house is on fire, nobody stays in the living room to discuss architectural aesthetics. Everyone runs toward the nearest exit, and in the world of finance, that exit is usually the global reserve currency. Therefore, holding physical cash in international currencies outside the local banking circuit becomes a vital safe conduct when the doors of financial institutions close indefinitely due to lack of liquidity. The third asset that survives collapse, and that often confuses external observers who expect a total market crash, is shares of productive companies with real export capacity. It is a documented phenomenon that, in the middle of Venezuelan hyperinflation, the Caracas Stock Exchange experienced nominal increases of more than 3,000% in extremely short periods of time. This happens because a share is not simply a speculative piece of paper. It is a legal property right over real assets such as factories, machinery, raw material inventories, and logistics distribution networks. If a company owns a warehouse full of steel coils, the value of that steel does not disappear because the local currency loses its usefulness. It simply takes more units of that devalued currency to represent the real value of that industrial material. However, we must be extremely selective at this point because not all companies have the necessary structure to survive a large-scale economic collapse. Companies that depend exclusively on domestic consumption and collect revenue in a dying currency usually go bankrupt due to the total destruction of their profit margins and the increase in their operating costs. Real protection is found in companies that produce essential goods and export them to international markets. These companies receive payments in hard currencies, while their internal labor costs are eroded by local inflation. In this scenario, the company acts as an economic energy transformer. It uses cheap local inputs to generate high-demand international value, which protects the shareholders' wealth against the collapse of the immediate economic environment. The fourth asset, and perhaps the most pragmatic and human of all, is basic consumer goods and items intended for direct barter, which become the real street currency. In post-war Germany, the cigarette became a unit of account much more stable than the mark itself. It allowed citizens to exchange tobacco for medicines, food, or even small properties. In situations of total collapse, the economy simplifies down to its foundations. Objects that guarantee daily survival acquire a value premium that defies any traditional market logic. Basic medicines, water filtration systems, hand tools, and personal hygiene products stop being simple merchandise and become negotiable capital in a market of extreme necessity. It is vital to understand that, although these goods are excellent for tactical survival and immediate exchange in the black market, they have the intrinsic limitation of being consumable and difficult to store on a large scale. You cannot build a 30-year retirement plan based exclusively on canned food and alkaline batteries, but you do need to have a strategic reserve of these elements to navigate the transition period. In Venezuela, for example, the exchange of professional services for food became the norm for a middle class that saw its salaries evaporate in a matter of weeks. This reminds us that value ultimately lies in utility. Therefore, investing in critical supplies is not only an act of preparation, it is also a way to ensure liquidity in a world where digital money has stopped having meaning for the local merchant. The fifth and final asset on our survival list is agricultural land, the only store of value that produces the resource human beings cannot do without: food energy. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, while urban centers suffered famine and mass evictions, families who owned productive land were at least able to secure their own subsistence through self-consumption. Land is the ultimate real asset because its value does not depend on a computer algorithm or on trust in a politician. It depends on biology and geology, factors completely unrelated to debt crises. However, owning land carries structural risks that must be analyzed with absolute seriousness. It is an immobile asset that cannot be easily hidden from the eyes of a state in need of resources. The main risk of land is its vulnerability to expropriation or confiscatory taxation, as happened in Zimbabwe during the land reforms of the year 2000. In that period, production collapsed after the violent takeover of farms. In addition, land requires active management and the ability to defend property in scenarios where the rule of law may have been significantly weakened by the economic crisis. Therefore, agricultural land is an excellent hedge against long-term inflation. But it should be seen as a legacy and subsistence asset, rather than a tool for immediate liquidity. It is the most resilient asset in terms of biological survival. But it is also the most exposed in terms of fiscal and political pressure. This reality requires careful legal planning for its proper preservation across generations. When observing the current global landscape, it is imperative to direct our attention toward the economy of the United States in an objective and technical way. We must move away from sensationalism while recognizing the real fiscal challenges. The national debt, which already exceeds $35 trillion, has stopped being an abstract figure. It has become a conditioning factor for global monetary stability. The most worrying data from an accounting point of view is that interest spending on that debt has recently surpassed the total budget allocated to national defense. This means that the system is dedicating more resources to servicing past financial commitments than to guaranteeing investment in security and technology for the future. Historically, this metric has signaled the beginning of a fatigue phase in great economic powers. Nevertheless, we must recognize that the United States has structural advantages that other nations that collapsed in the past did not have. Among them, being the issuer of the dominant reserve currency and possessing an unmatched capacity for technological innovation. The erosion of the dollar AS status is a real and visible process in the statistics of foreign central banks. However, it is a process that usually unfolds over decades and not through a sudden collapse. The risk for the ordinary citizen is not necessarily a disaster movie scenario. It is a persistent inflation that acts as a silent tax on their effort and their future saving capacity. In this context, preparation does not consist of feeding fear. It consists of recognizing that the rules of the monetary game are changing, and that diversification toward tangible assets is the most prudent path. The solution to this landscape of systemic fragility lies in building a personal wealth architecture that is resilient to multiple scenarios of financial and social stress. A truly diversified portfolio for the current times should not consist only of different types of digital assets. It should be a balanced combination of the survivors we have analyzed. This implies holding part of our wealth in physical metals as a last resort insurance. It also implies maintaining liquidity in several currencies to guarantee geographic mobility. And it implies owning land or real productive assets. Strategic preparation is, in essence, the transition from a mindset based on price speculation to a mindset of capital preservation and the generation of real utility in a world that demands concrete solutions. It is essential to understand that the economic system is a living organism. It goes through inevitable cycles of expansion, excess, and subsequent correction, needed to clean accumulated inefficiencies. We are witnessing a paradigm shift in the very nature of what we consider money and value in the age of information and massive debt. Those who ignore the lessons of history and blindly trust in the perpetual stability of paper institutions may find themselves unprotected when volatility forcefully returns to the main stage. However, those who act today with a long-term vision, securing tangible assets and developing skills that the market values regardless of the currency in use, will not only survive, they will prosper in the new order. Well, that is all for today. But before we leave, it is essential that we reflect on a truth that is often buried under the noise of financial markets and breaking news. True wealth is not a static number on a screen. It is the operational capacity of an individual to be useful and resilient in a changing environment. We have analyzed tangible assets such as gold, land, and currencies. But the ultimate hedge, what some experts call strategic human capital, lies in the combination of technical skills and community collaboration networks. It is not simply about accumulating objects for a possible crisis scenario. It is about transforming our mindset from absolute dependence on the fiat system toward a sovereignty based on real production and on the value we can provide to others when traditional structures fail. This perspective leads us to consider the concept of the productive refuge. In this refuge, knowledge about how to repair machinery, grow food efficiently, or manage basic health becomes a much more powerful medium of exchange than any banknote. History teaches us that in every major economic reset, those who prosper are not necessarily those who had the most paper money. They are those who possess the tools and the wisdom to reorganize production in their immediate environment. Therefore, the most sensible and balanced response to the fiscal uncertainty of powers such as the United States is not isolation or panic. It is constant investment in our own intellectual capital and in the creation of strong ties with people who share this vision of autonomy and responsible preparation. By understanding that economic cycles are natural processes of cleansing and renewal, we can stop seeing the future with fear. We can begin to see it as an opportunity to rebuild on much stronger and more honest foundations. The fragility of the current system is an invitation to diversify not only our money, but our very existence. It is about ensuring that our sources of livelihood and security do not depend on a single political or monetary thread. At the end of the day, the economy is a reflection of trust and human exchange. As long as we preserve the capacity to innovate, to cooperate, and to protect assets that have undeniable intrinsic value, there will always be a path toward prosperity. True financial security is knowing that no matter what happens to the value of paper, your ability to create, protect, and provide remains intact and under your own control. I hope this journey through the autopsy of economies and survival assets has provided you not only with technical information, I also hope it has given you the peace of mind of knowing that there are clear routes toward the preservation of your legacy. The key lies in acting with the calm of someone who understands the rules of the game, and with the determination of someone who is not willing to be a victim of macroeconomic circumstances. Keep your eyes on real indicators, keep your hands on productive assets, and keep your mind open to the lessons that history generously gives us in every generation. The wealth that survives the fire of crisis is the one that is built with prudence, protected with intelligence, and multiplied through real utility in the physical world we all share. Well, that is all. If you found this analysis useful, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next edition of Economy and World.